And what we'd like to do is take questions from the audience. I am happy to provide the microphone to you so you can ask your question. So I'll take some raised hands. I'll go back to the first one.
In contrast to a genius architecture or building, what do you consider the most livable building or aspirational building for what you'd like to see more of in Dallas?
I don't have any specific. I'd like to see a mix of things. I think that the city is defined by a mix of different typologies. So depending on where a project would be and what its use would be, I think would be determinative. And I don't think the city needs any one thing. The city needs a whole lot of things. I know I'm in downtown. I just living temporarily at least, or for a while, in downtown Dallas. And I know it wants to be, I think, a more livable city. People are starting to move in there. You see all the loft buildings that are converting into residential. And you see people at 5 o'clock walking their dogs and going to restaurants. And people are moving in. But there still isn't the infrastructure in that neighborhood for a real neighborhood, and our grocery store, school, all the things that you need to have a truly vibrant neighborhood. And the vacancy rate is pretty high. I feel like it's close to the tipping point where things start rolling downhill. But I guess that's
I just asked you, is there any building, like you say, in contrast to the star architecture, genius architecture buildings downtown, are there any buildings that are already downtown that resonate with you as a type of building that you think is a good building?
There are lots of great buildings downtown. I'm not going to go through like the list of
If you had a favorite one that resonated with you, in contrast to the star buildings you think you can't live in.
I don't know that there's star buildings that you can't live in.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure what.
You said Dallas, particularly Dallas, wants to use genius buildings or star architecture downtown. We want a more livable city, which I think is great. But I just didn't know if there was a building in contrast to these genius buildings that you thought that had the right look or feel for a livable city.
I don't think how things look necessarily is determinative of how they work. And a museum is going to look different than residential building or what have you. So.
I think some of the buildings that Paula was talking about are maybe some of the kind of buildings that we're thinking of here as buildings that are actually part of what you use every day and part of the fabric. Some of the buildings that you mentioned in Dallas and Fort Worth in particular.
And some of those buildings are being reused. One of those Dallas Power and Light buildings, the one in Oak Cliff, is been renovated, and is on the ground floor is a coffee roaster and some kind of artist, and a lawyer has his office on one floor and his apartments on others. So I think that those bones, even though some firehouses no longer function or police stations don't function the way they would, I think that those bones can still help make the city livable, even if the network isn't intact in the same way.
Yep, other questions?
With a title like Making Connections, the Networked City, do you see it as the networked cities that someday, as you started with the Lego plan, that we would be a dual city?
Well, when I moved here, I thought we were a dual city, but clearly I had a lot to learn. I spend most of my working days driving between Dallas and Fort Worth, and I know what the distance is now, and I think I understand what some of the challenges of that might be. But I think we are, I don't know if a dual city is the way to think about, and I don't like the word metroplex particularly either, even though I used it quite liberally in my talk. But I think maybe if we let go of the dual city idea and maybe come up with a different way of thinking about what we are, that more productive connections could be made. I know that's kind of verbally sliding out from under, but I think that as long as we maintain these, I'm an urbanist and I love cities, but as long as we maintain these kind of booster images of our individual cities, that we will all, our quality of living and the area will suffer. I guess, I don't know if that's an answer.
I completely agree. And one thing I will point out is that all of us are basically newcomers to Dallas-Fort Worth, so we have the complete newcomers committee here. And I have no allegiance to, I live in Fort Worth. I'll just confess that right now. And I have no allegiance to one place or the other in a way that I feel that many others do. And I really personally view it as a vast agglomeration of communities. But many people do not. I think I have a question here.
Thank you. I'm an outsider to the whole Metroplex, but it's fascinating to me that it seems like along this question of how to conceptualize the region, that one of the connections between your two presentations and that came up also in Kate's is about how different types of development have different scales and different parameters. Paula, you touched on this explicitly, that shape, the infrastructure of telephony requires a particular logic of substations. Likewise, the water system necessitates pumping stations to operate in one way, while school districts have a different set of parameters and logics and decision-making mechanisms. And so I was wondering, a lot of the character of the relationship among the many municipalities in this area must be determined by soft networks of the kind that Mark touched on, and that the patronage that produces these very different skylines and very different characters across cities in the region presumably has a lot to do with those kind of social armatures that people have built up. And I wonder if there are ways, Paula, that, for instance, or Kate, that you see the soft networks of the early 20th century and the mid-20th century, the particular social configurations of the region still underlying the way development happens today in the world that Mark is addressing.
That's a great question. And I actually feel like the project that I hope for us to work on next year that deals with all of these individual subdivisions will help give a better picture for some of that. So I think we know the history of some of our pieces of suburbs, but we don't know the history of other of our pieces of suburbs, or really how they fit together very well, and who was developing them and what their goals were and how they fit in with other pieces around them, and how these kids of parks changed from the way that they developed in the early 20th century to the years of the 1960s, especially, because of course the 60s and the 70s are so important for the continued expansion of, I love the word metroplex, and the way that it exists now. And so there's just a lot that we need to find out. I don't know if you...
I think the idea of looking to developers and the networks of development would be a great way to look at the difference between the old kinds of kits of parts and maybe the new. And I don't know if these developers are local people or whether they're coming in from other places. And I think that kind of distinction might be interesting to explore about how, who is making the decisions about these larger patterns. Studying the airport and the development of the airport might also be another really interesting way, because that involved networks from both of our municipalities, or big municipalities, coming together in a way that the old history would have said was impossible to do. So I think that might be interesting to do.
Questions?
Dallas has a lot of unique neighborhoods. They are unique in the form of architecturally and culturally. And that was the result of the way we developed with, a Swiss Avenue being maybe 1910, some of the other neighborhoods 1920, and you go on through these periods. And they are unique and divided in some ways. And is it the result of that uniqueness that has kept us from being totally networked? That's my first question. And the second one was approximately 10 years ago, Dallas moved from same park pavilions, civic architecture that would have been a kit, basically, to unique pavilions in each neighborhood that may have more reflected the architecture and culture and artistic elements of that neighborhood. Is that the way that we're moving in our civic infrastructure, that it be more at one with its immediate surroundings as architecture is important in its context?
I think that's a really interesting question. It leads me to want to point out that Kate and I, and we're all talking about this totalizing scheme and the Metroplex and forging connections as somehow being an ultimate good that we all want to go after. But the trend towards the local in response to the universal, the global, is very powerful here as in many other places. And we cannot forget that there are reasons why people fence off corners for themselves within a large metroplex. Because it is, as Kate was saying, it's overwhelming. You cannot understand it all at once. And I think it's I don't know, maybe natural is the wrong word, but it is an understandable response to the scale of what we're so I don't know if it's the future, but it makes perfect sense to me that would happen.
And I know in talking to Mark a little bit, some of the things that he's expressed an interest in talking about are neighborhoods, rather than looking just at buildings, but thinking about how neighborhoods work in Dallas. Right. I think we've talked about that.
Definitely.
Do you have more questions?
I'm from a North Dallas suburb with the Colony. It's kind of the edge of the Metroplex. So my vision of Dallas growing up was less the iconic images and more of the suburbs and the anonymous buildings that sort of make up, I think, most of the area. From the houses in the suburbs to the strip malls, and now the sort of large mall complexes that we see in like Frisco area. And I'm wondering what you guys think the role of those type of buildings play in the character of Dallas, or what they will play in the future. And then additionally, I'm wondering how the grid that we've sort of built Dallas on is maybe sorry, I lost my train of thought there. That has sort of guided how the building has been constructed and in what direction it will go, but mostly in relation to the change of landscape, because you talked about like the river and how it's been altered. But I think a lot of that stuff is due to the grid that covers most of America, this mile by mile organization. So I was wondering if you can talk about that.
Well, I think as for the first part of your question, I think the city is so diffuse that it will always be a nodal city. So I guess these little pockets, it's always going to be, to some extent, or to a large extent, an automotive city defined by these pockets. So the extent to which I'm not exactly sure what I'm supposed to answer, but those are obviously critical, and the nicer they are, the better the quality of life will be for the people who use them on a daily basis. The better those areas are connected to public transit, to amenities, the landscaped, etc., the better life will be. I'm sorry, what do you want?
Okay, well, I would just, I don't think this is news, probably not news to anyone, and then especially what Bob said in reference to what Bob was talking about in his lecture last night. As you point out, this is the reality. The strip malls and these more anonymous suburban building types that go on and on and on for miles in every direction in some places are what the fabric of this area is made up of in part, and it can't be ignored. I don't think it makes sense to simply devalue them. I think we have to understand them. Maybe not. People have done studies of commercial buildings as individual buildings, but I think maybe it makes sense to try to understand them in the patterns of land use rather than on the scale. I mean, also on the scale of the individual building, but understanding how things get put together here, on the scale of the municipality, but also on the scale of all of the connections between these municipalities and how arterials run together between places might be an interesting thing to do.
Relating to the grid, I think actually, I would say that the grid has been overridden, especially in Dallas, the center of Dallas, by the highway system. And I think a lot of the questions now about how Dallas is going to reform itself are going to be answered on how either the grid is either restored or how provisions are made to create access to places that have been divided off and by the noose. We're talking about the Trinity River. There are plans to completely rethink how the Trinity River relates to the city, but of course there was at one time there was grids that went down there, but now they're sort of chopped away from the city is so balkanized by the highways that figuring out exactly how to do that is a challenge. Now there's a big competition that's going to happen, and I'm hoping we get some of the best landscape architecture firms in the country to come and help submit plans for that, and maybe that'll be a whole new day for that area. So I think that's some question as to the future. And then also I think D Magazine recent proposal to knock down 365. It's a really interesting proposal. What happened if you would to take out that highway and reconnect downtown to Deep Ellum without? I think it's a very interesting proposal.